From the start of anime history in the early 1900s up through the early 1950s, animation existed mostly as a result of individual animators creating short films out of personal passion for the medium. Plenty of these were adaptations of stories which already existed, and plenty of them were completely original works devised by the artists. But it wasn't until the TV adaptation of Astro Boy in 1963 that anime started being made which based its storyboards directly on the manga source material. This quickly became the most popular method of anime production, with anime adapted directly from manga becoming so commonplace that it became noteworthy when an anime series actually is completely original. Because animation is expensive to produce quickly, it's a lot easier to greenlight a production that's already based on a popular series and which can feed its adaptation success back into the sales of the source material. It also helps that using manga or even light novels as a source material often answers a lot of questions about how to handle the visual presentation of the series. Nevertheless, there are plenty of benefits to production committees creating original works for animation, such as greater creative control over the story and also complete rights to the intellectual property which they generate. It's almost always going to benefit an animation studio more to have a successful original property than to have a successful adaptation, but it also puts a lot more pressure on the studio to create something that people love in order for it to succeed, instead of getting to rely on the built-in audience of a popular IP to cushion their landing. Not long after Mushi Productions started making headway with their TV anime, usually adapted from the works of studio head Tezuka Osamu sensei, Studio Toei, which was on a successful run of yearly film releases mostly adapted from classical stories since the 1950s, started producing original TV shows to compete with Mushi Pro at the start of the 60s. Other studios, including Mushi Pro, were quick to follow, and a lot of focus was put onto shows for children about robot characters that could have toys made out of them. It didn't take long for these robots to start growing huge, and in the early 70s there was a total boom of giant robot anime for kids. During that decade, a team from Mushi Pro had left the studio over disagreement with its creator-based production philosophy, believing that producers should be the central decision makers behind a studio. They went and formed Studio Sunrise, which rapidly expanded throughout the 70s and put their focus onto original giant robot shows that could be marketed with toys. But in 1974, the landscape of original anime would be shaken by the incredible mainstream success of the military space drama Space Battleship Yamato. This story, set mostly on the bridge of a space version of a famous Japanese battleship, led by the charismatic captain that would arguably become anime's first truly iconic original character and be ripped off endlessly in other shows, can practically be thanked for the whole aesthetic and structure of animated sci-fi adventure serials for generations to come. But Yamato wasn't the last original anime to shake the future of the medium. Inspired by its success, animation legend Yoshiyuki Tomino-san pitched his Mobile Suit Gundam show to Studio Sunrise, which released in 1979 and ended up creating the single most enduring original animation franchise of all time. It's hard to consider any original anime to be anywhere near as important as Yamato or Gundam, but out of all the people inspired by those shows directly, there was another creator who would bring original anime to a whole new place in 1995. That, of course, being Anno Hideaki with the creation of the experimental psychological mecha series Neon Genesis Evangelion, the impact of which I covered in my video, How Evangelion Altered Anime Eternally. After that success, the 90s went from being a decade in which Studio Sunrise was doing interesting stuff with original anime to being a decade in which everyone was doing interesting stuff with original anime. Even still, Sunrise seized the moment to prove that they would always be remembered as the absolute gods of original anime by dropping one of the most critically beloved animated shows ever made in 1998 in the form of Cowboy Bebop. If Evangelion represented a turning point for anime on the whole, Bebop represented a turning point for one segment of Studio Sunrise. Keep in mind that by 1996, Sunrise actually consisted of 10 different studios with their own teams, with 90s originals Escaflowne and Cowboy Bebop coming from Studio 2, previously responsible for Gundam creator Tomino's Aura Battler Dunbine and a lot of 80s and 90s Gundam. It was also in the mid-90s that Sunrise was outright purchased by Bandai, and in fact, at the time of of this writing, Studio Sunrise technically doesn't even exist anymore, because it's called Bandai Namco Filmworks now, after all the mergers that have gone down over the past 25 years. You can find infamous stories of the dissatisfaction that animators on the Brave series of mecha shows had felt about the working conditions and creative pressures brought about by the merger. But whether or not that had any direct impact on the decisions made by the Bebop staff, it didn't take long after they had made one of the greatest animated TV shows ever for the team leads of that project to decide that their talents were too big to be contained, and they left to form a new studio that you've very likely become familiar with over the decades, called Studio Bones. While Bones created a completely unremembered original kids series right away, and the adaptation of Clamp's Angelic Lair, and started off working with one foot still back in Studio Sunrise on the co-produced Cowboy Bebop movie, they quickly made their intentions to copy in the madcap experimental original spirit of Evangelion very clear with the production of their own crazy mecha series, Razafon, followed before long by the proper reemergence of the majority of the Bebop team in the creation of head writer Nobumoto Keiko Sensei's Wolf's Rain. Following that up with the well-received adaptation of the scrapped Princess light novel series, as well as the globally beloved Fullmetal Alchemist manga, which I've already covered in the 6th episode of Anime Alphabet, Studio Bones very quickly made a name for themselves as the premier place for action-adventure animation and awesome original content, even when added into their adaptation work, though that wouldn't stay true for long. The early 2000s ended up being a kind of golden age for original anime, but as someone who got into anime around that time and consumed a whole lot of the stuff getting released, I completely understand what brought this wave to a stop. Anime around this time was very much about creating unique worlds, distinct characters, and creative visual aesthetics, but a lot of the time the stories ended up being pretty much exactly the same. I've watched so many gangs of misfits group up and save the world that the back half in particular of the average adventure show became incredibly predictable and increasingly boring to me. All of these cool settings and characters end up bleeding into one another when all of them reach a point where the characters have nothing to do besides progress the plot forward until enough has been explained that we can justify how they're going to beat the bad guys and save the planet. Every one of these 26-episode adventures ending in a planet-scale threat ended up feeling old hat to me in the face of two anime that came in the mid-2000s, and in my opinion killed the genre such that nobody would feel the need to attempt it again for a while. If I had to put the pin on it precisely, I'd place it on Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann in 2007 for taking the scale of the standard action-adventure structure to the furthest possible extreme, basically making the act of saving the world look passé by comparison to what its characters accomplish. That show's also incredibly well written and nuanced, and might even be a more directly effective coming-of-age story in the way that it communicates. But I also think that in its punchiness and brevity, it still leaves us room to appreciate a decompressed, full-breathing version of that story, which takes its time to flesh out everything to the most satisfying degree that it can. I think there are lots of great coming-of-age stories in animation, and lots of great original animated stories as well. And so when I say that Eureka 7 is anime's greatest coming-of-age original, I mean it is very high praise. I will get into the bones of everything I think Bones could have done better, and even discuss how the way that it handles its coming-of-age themes makes me consider it a more complete exploration of them than even the more clearly communicated Gurren Lagann. I'm Trixie the Golden Witch. You can find more of my writing on goldenwitch.substack.com, and this is my series of in-depth deep dives on anime classics called Anime Alphabet. Until the release of Eureka 7 in 2005, I think there were three productions of utmost importance to Eureka 7's existence. First of these, of course, was Cowboy Bebop, not only because its creation dovetailed directly into the existence of Studio Bones, but also because it introduced Eureka 7 lead writer Sato Dai into the world of TV anime, thanks to his friendship with series creator Shinichiro Watanabe, whose encouragement he credits with pushing him into the industry at all. Sato-san debuted as a TV writer on Cowboy Bebop, providing the scripts for 3 episodes, which make his specializations as a writer immediately clear. Jamming with Edward, Bohemian Rhapsody, and Brain Scratch are all extremely focused on interfacing with technology and the ability therein to affect reality and the minds of people who interact with it. Sato-san's ability to write so confidently about technology undoubtedly got him scouted by his other noted mentor, Ghost in the Shell standalone complex series composer Kamiyama Kenji, who would employ Sato-san to write 5 episodes of each season and to bring that that show's conception of the internet to life. I definitely think that the philosophical undercurrents of what the internet symbolizes in that series must have subtly inspired some of the world building in Eureka 7, but we can talk about how that is much later into this project. Cowboy Bebop lead writer Nobumoto Keiko would also employ Sato-san for 7 episodes of her own original concept in Wolf's Reign. Bones would then hire Sato-san again to write 4 episodes of their largely forgotten sci-fi original, The Mars Daybreak, and Watanabe-sensei would employ him again to write on Samurai Champloo around the time that he was starting to conceptualize a new original project with 2 other important employees at Studio Bones. Character designer Kenichi Yoshida-san got his start as an in-between animator working for Studio Ghibli on their seminal 1991 film Only Yesterday, and stayed with that studio through the 90s, appearing in all of their major works, while occasionally popping out to do sometimes uncredited freelance works with other studios on stuff like Giant Robo and Neon Genesis Evangelion. And then he left the studio to go freelance in 1999, mostly taking up jobs with Studio Sunrise and Bones. He got his first character design job on the absolutely insane Sunrise original from returning Gundam director Tomino Yoshiyuki-sama, Overman King Geiner. Whatever you may think of that show's story, its art style is incredibly eye-catching, and in my opinion, Yoshida-san's work coalesced better with the style of early 2000s digital animation than anything else of its time. Also thanks to the fantastic color designers on both Geiner and Eureka 7, those shows have truly stood the test of time on the design front in a way most stuff from their era hasn't. Director Kyoda Tomoki got his start as a storyboard artist and episode director working on gag comedy adaptations with studio Group TAC in the late 90s, stating that he started his career having been inspired by the works of comedy director Akitaro Daiichi, perhaps best known in the West for Kodocha and the original Fruits Basket adaptation, but most relevant to Kyoda-san's early work was also the director of shows like Sexy Commando Gaiden, and would later go on to direct gag manga Biori and Tonkatsu DJ Agataro, just to pull my favorite deep cuts. Kyoda-san would end up doing design work on an original series animated by Group TAC from a concept by legendary sci-fi anime director and mecha designer Kawamori Shoji called The Daiichi's Earth Defense Family. If you don't know Kawamori-san, I can best summarize his influence by telling you that he literally designed Optimus Prime from the Transformers series, created Macross, and has been the mechanical designer on more shows than you could possibly be aware of unless you're really keeping track. Kyoda-san would then provide key animation for Kawamori-sensei's next directorial work, Earth Maiden Arjuna, and likely through this connection was able to bring Kawamori into the design process of Eureka 7, for which he would become the mechanical designer and probably had a lot of influence over the undercurrent themes of the story, given the many thematic similarities between Eureka 7 and Earth Maiden Arjuna. When asked about Kawamori-san in an interview once, Kyoda-san stated that the man is even more interesting than you could understand just from his works, and that if he were to start talking about him, he would have to go on for hours. I would assume that Kyoda-san left Group TAC in 2001, as his next work would be some storyboarding for Studio Gonzo's Full Metal Panic adaptation right before he got pulled over to Studio Bones to offer extensive episode direction and storyboarding on their newly opened Second Branch's first major original series, the experimental mecha anime Razafon. If I had to try and explain Razafon simply, it's like if Evangelion had been made with seemingly the same mentality behind the production of Cowboy Bebop. I think it unfortunately played things a little too close to Eva and drew a lot of unfavorable comparison, especially because Evangelion was already very experimental, and so paying homage to it in places only made Razafon read like a ripoff to many, when really it's even more outlandish in how much it lets each person working on it really sort of go crazy with their ideas for something in this genre. It's a rumbly road, but full of some really remarkable episodes worth returning to, including my personal favorite 19, which Kyoda-san storyboarded and definitely has the same energy as Eureka 7 in its overall feel. He would also end up directing the Razafon feature film, which released in 2003. Coming off the heels of Razafon, Studio Bones had reached the point of having 3 separate active branches. Studio A, which was about to waste a lot of time creating the mostly forgotten action drama Kurao Phantom Memory. Studio C, which was formed to produce Fullmetal Alchemist and was surging with the show's success and laying out their ambitious plans for the Conqueror of Shambhala film. And Studio B, which was wasting even more time than Studio A, creating the even less remembered The Mars Daybreak. Perhaps the success of Fullmetal Alchemist had cushioned the blow of those undersold original works, because the next original work they would throw themselves at was incredibly more ambitious, with a full 50-episode run ordered in the style of another epic evolving adventure along the lines of Fullmetal Alchemist. Director Kyoda Tomoki, writer Sato Dai, and character designer Yoshida Kenichi were all approaching their mid-30s, and all at tepid points in their career where they'd kind of made a splash with some success in their early work, but also needed to prove that they could be consistently successful if they wanted a long career in the industry. To quote Sato-san directly from an interview that he gave to Anime News Network, the whole idea behind it was that we were assigned the task of bringing robots alive into our world. Everything else was up to interpretation between the three of us, so we basically went with our feelings and the ideas we had in our minds. Then we put those concepts into the show as emotions we wanted the viewers to feel themselves. There was a lot of pressure at the time because at the age of 35 in Japan, if we mess up, I would most likely never be a part of the anime industry again. So what we wanted to do was put forth 100% of our effort. If it had failed, I would have accepted that with a loss, but we went ahead and put all of our blood, sweat, and tears into the work we wanted to produce, and it worked out. I feel the need to emphasize the blood, sweat, and tears bit. In another ANN interview with director Kyoda-san, he is complimented on the incredibly detailed world building of Eureka 7 and asked how important that aspect is to his productions. Kyoda-san answers thusly: "When we were working on the original Eureka 7, we had very little pre-production time compared to other anime. We couldn't have more time to build the story, so instead we came up with all the details of a world that could be the main trunk of a story. So for the production process, the worldview and detailed designs of everything was very important, but that just becomes flavor for the viewer." I actually disagree strongly with the end of Kyoda-san's statement, as I think the design aspects are by far the most striking and memorable things about Eureka 7 and have outlasted the actual impact of the narrative considerably. I think the story of Eureka 7 is more told in its aesthetics than even in its actual plot, and it isn't too surprising to me that the narrative was the most rushed aspect of the show's construction, as I could feel that in ways which I will eventually describe when we dive into the show proper, particularly towards the end. But suffice it to say that I think between the incredible wealth of ideas brought to the table by all of the core designers that worked on the series, they managed to create something aesthetically unforgettable. Even though Eureka 7 seems to be most often credited to Sato-san for its overall creation, Sato-san himself states in interviews that the project was already mostly conceived when he was brought on to structure it and give it form in writing. "Technically, the show was never in my control," he says. "When I was requested to do the work, they already had an outline they wanted me to go along with, so as far as that goes, it isn't really my own original project that came from my personal creativity. Of course, we will always have those little quirks as writers that become part of the work, but overall it was a pre-existing idea, and the director asked me to follow his guidelines when writing scripts." So if it wasn't mostly Sato's idea, then who really had the spark to create Eureka 7? I'd be most inclined to look to director Kyoda-san next, but even if he might have been the most integral person to the show's construction, he certainly doesn't seem to feel responsible for how it ended up. As he put it in retrospect during an interview about the new High Evolution film series, "The story up until the beginning of Renton's journey in episode 3 was my primary motivation for making Eureka 7 in the first place, I think. There was an overarching plot we had prepared, but over the course of its lengthy 50-episode production period and broadcast, that changed. Eventually I changed things so it became more about what everyone wanted to do, not just what I wanted to do. In any line of work, there are inevitabilities that prevent you from achieving what you could under ideal conditions. There are ways our staff, including myself, could have done better, but we don't always have the opportunity to do so. It's because these projects are supported by external investment. We've had several titles with the Eureka title attached to them up to now, and each was produced with a certain theme in mind. But sometimes that theme isn't what the people who make our work possible want. Sometimes we must stay our hand so that we can provide the product that they require of us, or at least what we understand as what they want from us. So there's no single clear answer I can give you when you ask what the theme is." Indeed, Kyoda-san is extremely insistent in interviews not only that it isn't his place to speak on the themes of Eureka 7, but also that not only did the TV series represent everything that his team was capable of providing within the parameters they were given at the time, but also that the ability to make something at that level has only diminished over time. When asked about the increased use of CGI across the High Evolution films, Kyoda-san explains that the kind of super animators who were capable of hand animating complex robot animation at an effective speed simply don't exist enough anymore to make that kind of animation possible. As he puts it, CGI robot animation is almost hard to get wrong, while hard-drawn robot animation is extremely easy to mess up with even a couple of errant lines. And so at this point, the anime industry mostly sees the reliance on hand-drawn robot animation to be frankly irresponsible. All things considered, it's actually insane to me that Eureka 7 is as good as it managed to end up being, and it isn't a surprise that nothing of its like has really come again since. Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann famously spent 4 years years in pre-production and was shaved down considerably from its early conception into a lean, perfected product that could stand the test of time. And if I'm honest, I think that show holds up better in the long run by spending so much time in the oven. But considering that Gurren Lagann released in 2007, this means that it began its pre-production before Eureka 7 did, and then didn't even actually begin animation production, which had been done very quickly on that show, until after the 50-episode Eureka 7 was already over. Considering how much Eureka 7 owes to the works of Studio Gainax, it's hard to say if Gurren Lagann was borrowing anything from Eureka 7 in turn, or simply pulling from a lot of the same influences, but I certainly know this. I watched Gurren Lagann in November 2007 and immediately declared it my favorite anime of all time. I then watched Eureka 7 just a few weeks later and declared that my new favorite anime of all time. Then I watched F: A Tale of Memories on New Year's and declared that my new favorite anime. Then in February of the next year, I watched Arjuna and declared that my new favorite anime. Look, I was watching a lot of anime at the time. Eventually though, I kind of settled on Eureka 7 as my overall favorite in reflection, and the show which had influenced my personal ethos perhaps the most out of all these shows, which were appealing to me precisely because I was 16 years old and experiencing my own attempt to come of age into some kind of early adulthood. Before I go any further into talking about Eureka 7 as a coming-of-age story though, I feel the need to clarify that I singled out this aspect of the show's narrative because I think it's what Eureka 7 most uniquely accomplishes well, even if it isn't the only major theme explored by the story, nor was it intended to be the sole central focus of the story. Anime News Network pointed out to director Kyoda-san how mecha anime is often focused on the coming-of-age journey, and asked him what set his apart from the rest of the genre, which he answered thusly. One of the core concepts behind the original Eureka 7 was to do our takes on the various tropes of traditional mecha anime, so it certainly fits into the genre with its coming-of-age theme, but if we were to ask ourselves if that imitational aspect is integral to Eureka 7, I think it's actually not. The very concept of having children ride mecha into battle requires convincing context to be realistic, so I've certainly used familiar tropes to hide what's required for that context under a more compelling story. But I am starting to think, especially in a modern context, that in order for the show to be meaningful for children now, that I need to break out of that mold going forward. For complete context, this quote can partially be taken as Kyoda-san's explanation for why he doesn't feel the need to focus on coming of age as an integral part of Eureka 7's storytelling in his approach to constructing the sequel, such as the High Evolution films, which this interview was conducted primarily to speak on. Nevertheless, I find this quote important because it really drives home how much the very core premise of Eureka 7, handed down to its primary staff by the production committee, was to create a compelling show about young people piloting giant robots into battle. After all, the show was created as a result of good old Bandai's desire to produce a mecha series with the title Eureka 7 with Studio Bones. Yes, the title was the first thing about the project, and the studio initially wasn't going to take the project, but ended up doing so out of their interest in creating a mecha series with designs by Kawamori Shoji, and on the condition that they could scrap Bandai's concept and let their staff come up with their own thing. Not unlike Watanabe Shinichiro's Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo productions, the conception of Eureka 7 seems to have come from slurring together all sorts of recognizable aesthetic influences that intrigued the creators, finding thematic through lines between the culture and histories behind those aesthetics, and then building a story around finding a way for all of that to logically fit together. On the subject of the show's frequent references to other media and its titling conventions, Kyoda-san said, "The majority of these names and references weren't made with a Western audience in mind. They were just ideas that we always loved, like the main character in Trainspotting, Renton, was a goofy guy, and we wanted to create someone who would resemble that kind of character in his style and goofiness. So as the tentative working name, we just put Renton in the pitch, but when we got the green light, the higher up said, 'Do not change this guy's name.' So that's how we ended up with that character's surname being the first name of our main character. Basically, we put all the influences we felt from all the overseas media we were fond of into Eureka 7, so it wasn't intentional, but if anyone discovered it, we wanted them to get a good laugh at it." Regardless of how deep the thought was that went into these name choices, getting a peek into the tastes of the creators is hugely edifying to understanding why they went about creating the story the way they did. For instance, Eureka 7 has one of the most eclectic soundtracks in all of anime, incorporating 7 to 10 minute trance electronic songs, post-rock character themes, and traditional orchestral score that feels heavily influenced by video games like Final Fantasy and The Legend of Zelda. The only thing I can easily compare it to is the filmography of Danny Boyle, whose films like Trainspotting, 127 Hours, and Slumdog Millionaire use an eclectic appreciation for excellent music to underscore all kinds of awesome scenes in ways that most directors never consider. You can feel not just the stylistic connection in how the original score is combined with original songs from already popular musicians like Denki Groove, but even how the tastes of the staff were obviously influenced by the stuff that appears in Danny Boyle's films. Considering Kyoda-san's rather artsy taste, and the fact that he was coming off of directing the infamously bonkers Razafon film, there's something funny to me about him going straight from that into handling a comparably very straightforward and traditional story with a lot more consistency in presentation necessitated to keep it functional. Having said that, I also don't want to overstate how much impact Kyoda-san actually had over the final product. After all, he was extremely clear that only the first 3 episodes really amounted to the story that he'd originally intended to tell. It seems very likely to me that a bulk of the world building, influences, and overall conception of what kind of story Eureka 7 is and what it would try to communicate in its themes was all decided in a series of meetings between Kyoda-san, Kawamori-san, and Kenichi-san, which were then explained to their core staff and converted into a pitch, which Bandai approved and sent back notes on, and then sent back a whole bunch more notes once the show was actually airing and they started deciding the course they wanted to take it going forward. While Kyoda-san would serve as director for the whole series, he only independently served as episode director on episode 50 and storyboarded episodes 1 through 3, episode 9, 14, which is a recap episode, 19, 33, 49, and 50. And I'll get into what the episodes he chose to handle say about his style later on, but for now I'll just point out that each of the show's 7 episode writers, 18 storyboard artists, and 23 episode directors left their own distinct marks on the series, to say nothing of the animators, colorists, and so on and so forth. I will talk about a handful of specific staff in this video, but considering the sheer scale of this show's production, I think it would get out of hand if I tried to talk about every noteworthy name that's on the project. In truth, I do think Eureka 7 is the rare kind of series whose sum of its parts may be greater than its whole. After rewatching the show, I struggle to say that I think it's so exceptionally well written that it deserves to be compared to the incredible wit of Super Dimensional Fortress Macross, or the dramatic intensity of Mobile Suit Gundam, or even just the perfectly realized thematic conception of Gurren Lagann. But I also understand how this show connected with me in a more personal way than any of those series did, because of how much I can relate to some of the emotions that some of these creators poured into this work. I won't be surprised at all when I read comments on this video from viewers that were most intrigued with and most bored with a completely different list of episodes from the one that I will give in the course of this video. And I also won't be surprised if those people feel as I do that Eureka 7 is a show that intellectually I can't help but consider like a strong 8 to a light 9, even though I'm compelled to carry it around in my heart like it's a 10 out of 10. Reading staff interviews to get context into the creation of Eureka 7, the thing which intrigued me the most was how Kyoda-san specifically considered the first 3 episodes as the one which he was the most invested in creating, and most satisfied with the results of. These episodes comprise the introduction of main character Renton in his hometown of Belforest, where he lives with his mechanic grandfather, and is whisked away by the end of episode 3 to join the Gecko State gang of surfing terrorists. Each of these episodes is worth talking about individually, and all 3 were written and storyboarded by lead writer Sato-san and series director Kyoda-san respectively, though each of them has a different episode director. Before we can dive into the first episode proper though, we of course have to talk about the first thing which greets us when starting up the series, the iconic soaring first opening theme song from Flow. This act was eventually going to be much better known for the very similar Code Geass opening, and their bombastic, feel-good, floaty take on pop music is always instantly engaging and delightful. This one has such a dramatic liftoff into its chilled-out vibe that it sets the tone of the series perfectly. All at once hopeful and dramatic, emotionally intense, and yet also under control and in the zone, flying over the clouds with purpose and yet without tension. At the very heart of the whole design philosophy of Eureka 7's world is the fact that the mecha fly by way of giant surfboards. Sato-san investigated surfer culture to get a sense of the themes that would flow from this central concept, and a lot of the pre-production effort went into just realizing how these robots were going to be animated and what the world would have to be like to justify their existence. Much of the show's identity flows out of simply having answered the question of make a show about kids in robots with, okay, how about they surf? I think it is also telling that in spite of their mandate, the creators only decided to put 2 children inside of robots, those being the main character Renton and child soldier Eureka, and much of the show is dedicated just to making their involvement in the story seem justified. While the show doesn't waste any time at all showcasing the way that its mecha fight in the superbly staged, colored, and animated opening scene, it does hold off on introducing its child protagonist, instead introducing us to a trio of older guys who find themselves in a brief combat engagement. That the opening monologue is given by Stoner on the subject of how one's memory of a piece of media is most often connected to the people that they experience it with truly does convey a sense of breadth in the show's intentions. I get the impression that Sato-san felt most comfortable starting his script on a statement he found interesting in and of itself, and the way that the character attributes the quote to himself really makes me feel like Stoner was built as a self-insert character for Sato-san, given that he is in fact the writer of the Ray Out magazine, which Gecko State publishes, and can't help himself but to write out loud a lot of the time. I've always found Stoner to be one of the most personally relatable and easily likable side characters in the show myself, in part because he feels so well realized in his dialogue. The fact that Stoner is actually riding in the back seat of a mecha, taking high quality photos of the action going on in the other mechs around him with a DSLR, is immediately as inventive in context as the existence of the surfing robots to me. It brings a feeling of completeness and complexity to what would otherwise just be a random action scene establishing the characters and where they're going. But because there's also a journalist on board adding his own stakes in that he's trying to get the perfect shot of the action, just beefs up the scene to a level of memorability. We're also introduced to Matthew in this scene, whom I find noteworthy for being a good-looking black character design. Anime doesn't tend to have a lot of black characters, or to put a lot of thought into their designs when they do, but Eureka 7 is particular to create characters of many different races, body types, and features with a stylized sense of realism that brings its future world to life immediately. Just the sight of Stoner in his writer's hat with his weird little goatee and the lanky Matthew in his jersey instantly sells the casually multicultural identity of the series on the whole, which we'll have plenty of time to talk about in more detail later. Any hardcore mecha fan will likely key in right away to the introduction of a white-haired ace pilot in a red mecha tearing through opponents at a speed that makes them look inept, and realize that this character must be the Char analog. Mobile Suit Gundam and the shows inspired by it are almost biblically required to include a light-haired rival character to the protagonist with a red mecha that goes really fast. But the course of Eureka 7 will quickly reveal that Holland is much more than a Char clone. Actually, he's much more of a Bright Noah, but I'm not gonna get too down deep into a Gundam hole here before the time comes. In all honesty, as much as I appreciate the technical mastery of Eureka 7's action imagery, I can't say that I would have been hooked by the opening scene, or even really that the mecha action does a whole lot for me in the series on the whole. I do find it visually intriguing, and I can remember the first time I saw a lot of the show's more dramatic battles, but rewatching them I was rarely gripped by the action itself, and sometimes found myself sort of drifting in attention during the less dramatic action scenes. I suspect a big part of why mecha anime can be difficult for many people to connect with is that a lack of human faces on screen can start to make you feel depersonalized and disconnected from the story. For people that empathize more easily with humanoid machines and see them more similarly to people, or even for those who wish they could take or have control over that form themselves, it is inherently exciting to see cool-looking robots. At the time I first saw this show in 2007, I know that the uniqueness of the designs and the humanism given to the Nirvash robot that I suspect was partially inspired by how Tomino-san started handling mechs in Turn A Gundam and Geiner as having a sort of willful soul, was intriguing to me and kept me a little bit more engaged with the robot scenes. But as I've gotten jaded to seeing the surfing mechs over the last 15 years, I've stopped caring as much about all but the couple of most excellent battles in the series. To speak of the LFO designs themselves, I think they are incredibly strong and distinctive mecha designs, and especially I love that each of the main ones is considerably different and has its own purpose in the action, even if a lot of them aren't extremely memorable to me as someone that isn't hugely into robots, and had forgotten about most of the differences between them before rewatching the show. Most interesting to me is the names of the robots, being that each one is named after one of Roland's famous synthesizers from the 1980s, which had a massive impact on the electronic music genre over the following decades. Most famous among them now probably being the 808, which also happens to be my favorite mecha design in the show besides the iconic Nirvash Type 0. Electronic music is a major influence on the entire series, which comes thematically to the forefront around the show's midpoint, and I think naming the mechs in reference to the technology that makes that music possible was a brilliant detail, and can also lead you into learning a lot of history of music if you look into all of those synthesizers. Also brilliant was the decision to introduce Renton by way of hyper-detailed shots of his bedroom. Teenagers tend to reify their identities by surrounding themselves with physical reflections of the image that they want to have for themselves, hence why my room was completely covered in posters of cute anime girls around the time I watched this show for the first time. And Renton's room instantly tells a lot both about who he is right now and who he wants to be. Next to his dresser, where sits pictures of his family cleverly partly concealed by his old sneakers, is a stack of boxes likely containing his obsessions and aspects of his identity from early childhood, which have been set aside so that the stacks of magazines can start inhabiting the space. His walls are covered in posters and shelves with boxes, all of which to me give the vague impression of hobbyist gear. There's something that looks like surf wax on the top shelf, and most of the posters pertain to LFOs, lifting, which is what sky surfing is called, and a big Talho pinup that we could maybe recognize from seeing her briefly in the opening scene and the OP, though she looks pretty different. More than anything though, looking at this stuff made me feel like I was in a shop for model kits. Just the shape of these boxes reminded me of Gunpla boxes, and I couldn't help feeling like the other boxes were full of paint kits and other customization tools. Maybe it was just the mecha association making me think that, but to me the overall intent here seemed to be a reflection of what the creators considered to be the intended audience of the series. Somehow Renton's room finds the intersection of what a kid who's into popular countercultural sports like surfing, whose culture is portrayed kind of similarly to skateboarding in this series as well, since that's what writer Sato-san had personal experience with, and with that of a kid who's into anime and gunpla building. It also helps that his walls are weirdly metallic, which also lends a kind of sci-fi texture to the scene, even though the reason he lives like this will be revealed soon as very ordinary. His room is just like an outhouse to his granddad's mechanic warehouse. Of course, the most prominent posters over Renton's headboard are full spreads of Holland doing his famous cutback drop turn, and his 909 LFO, which we were introduced to just earlier, doing the same. Incidentally, we can argue about Talho's various hairstyles more later, but this little poster of her in Renton's room is the outright best she ever looked, in my opinion. How much you find yourself instantly engaged with Renton's story will likely have something to do with your own level of personal interest in machines. As much as many of us can connect to his obsessive passion for his interests, only the people who actually feel as intimately connected to machines as Renton does will probably feel the same sense of excitement just at seeing the way that his surfboard attaches to his bike, because a moment like this basically serves just to ensure you that this setting's mechanics are going to be thoroughly thought through. For me though, it wasn't even the very detailed and cinematic shot compositions that caught my attention first. After all, I probably watched this show in like 240p on VO in 2007, but rather Renton's unforgettable theme song, Story Writer by Supercar, which is easily one of the most notable shoegaze tracks in anime soundtrack history. Speaking as a huge fan of the genre and of this song, my biggest complaint with its usage is always just that I wish it was twice as loud, but I understand how that would have been off-putting for general audiences, and they were already pushing it by using a song with vocals in it from a relatively niche genre and for several minutes straight across the episode's start. Still, it was a worthy risk to me, because being drawn in by the art style was one thing, but hearing music that actually resonates with me personally in an anime was incredibly rare in the late 2000s, when I was listening to mostly pretty eclectic stuff. Considering this show aired in 2005, I would even say that Story Writer feels almost ahead of its time, as it's closer to the kind of shoegaze that would come out of Japan en masse a few years later than to what had already existed beforehand. Alright, so what makes this song so special? Well, shoegaze is generally pretty dreary and dissociated music. It's basically the sound of melting into the wallpaper and slowly fading away. But it can also be the sound of trying to conquer that pervasive ennui and capture a feeling that can compel you to action. There is a hazy kind of comfort to the walls of noise generated by shoegaze guitar riffs, even though they can be so impenetrably dense that it can be hard to listen to if you're not specifically aiming to feel that kind of dissociated feeling. Ordinarily, a quiet, dreary, and dissociated song wouldn't seem like a good fit for the opening of an adventure show, but that's okay because Story Writer very much falls into the style of thematically seeking to break through the stagnant mold. The song opens with about 30 seconds of meditative electronic ambience, settling you into a relaxed state before a sudden flash of guitar and drum kicks in. More specifically, the very recognizable drum samples built out of the Amen break, known as the single most influential 10 seconds of music ever recorded for its its importance to electronic production. The Amen break keeps trying to break through and is even joined by a chopped up vocal as the rock song tries to overpower and break free of the ambient track that it's trapped inside of. Eventually, the full force of the thing finally punches through and is lifted to soaring heights by this high-pitched keyboard melody that brings instant gratification to every magnificent scene it finds itself playing over throughout the series. Most notable to me though is how the guitar chords underneath it actually descend slowly, as if lilting in disappointment, before climbing back up rapidly at the end of each stanza to rejoin the soaring melody at the top. It feels like the guitar wants to be where the keyboards are at and is endlessly struggling and toiling in a loop on its way there. The only thing that can bridge the gap between them is the vocal, which seems to patiently fight its way through the languidity of its state on the way to catching that huge wave on the word surf that finally lifts it up above even the highest notes of the key melody. Towards the very end of the song, a huge wah-wah and a noisy synth wash out the back end of it into an interesting, somewhat raised but still very meditative place at the end. It's a very ambient chord to end on, interestingly to me, because Renton's journey really doesn't end up being about achieving victory or catharsis so much as achieving a tenuous peace, and I think that's what we get at the end of this absolutely phenomenal track. A lot of people that I've talked about or watched Eureka 7 with found themselves almost immediately disliking Renton Thurston by way of how he introduces himself with his narration in this scene. He declares that in his 14 years of life, nothing interesting has happened, and he doesn't expect anything interesting to happen anytime soon. He considers his to be the worst life, really laying in on the word saiyaku, meaning the worst, in the original Japanese dub, as a sort of punchline that he attaches to every bad thing that happens to him. But if I had to pinpoint exactly what it is that makes Renton seem so hateable right off the bat, and also what makes it obvious to me that you're supposed to think he's kind of a fuckboy, which I always assure people is indeed the point, and promise it pays off big time in the long run for him to be like this now, but it's the fact that he's got a big dumb smile on his face when he looks at his compact drive and takes off on his bike while he's saying that his life is the worst. I'd be willing to bet that a lot of people who have the same mentality Renton does about their life would be able to connect with them, but I also think a lot of people will immediately wonder what the hell this kid has to complain about when he's got his own motorcycle and surfboard at 14 and the freedom to head off into this awesome looking fantasy town at what seems like his own discretion. He doesn't even actually look upset about his own situation when he isn't projecting in front of other people, including the audience that he's narrating to. Because the staff chose to present the visuals from an objective perspective while allowing Renton to explain his own subjective angle on what's happening in his dialogue, we as viewers are given the room to form our own opinion on the matter and cast our own judgments on Renton's attitude. When Renton meets up with the guy who sells him refboarding stuff out the back of his van near the only lifting spot in town, we get some context into who Holland is and why Renton admires him so much. Apparently Holland executed a cutback drop turn when he was Renton's age, and so Renton aims to prove that he can do something just as impressive and hopes to eventually pilot an LFO to do that trick like Holland went on to do as well. However, his town has no tower and therefore no waves and therefore no other refboarders for this guy to profit from, and so he is skipping town, leaving Renton even lower down the scale than he was before, again reflecting what the guitar is doing in the soundtrack. Being from Virginia Beach, I completely understand what it's like to be next to the ocean and think it seems like an obvious place to surf, only to realize there's basically no waves, and the ocean is disgusting because Hampton Roads is mostly shipyards. When the salesman tells him that Holland is from North Shore, it's the same as saying he's from the west coast of the United States to an Easterner, because that's where the waves are. I love the match cut from Renton dropping his refboard to some kind of heavy industrial equipment pounding into the earth as Renton rides the trolley into town. Additionally to shipyards, Hampton Roads is home to a ton of military bases and airports, so the noise pollution here is completely the fuck out of control. I had to stop this recording a minute ago because a bunch of dogs were howling at a jet. And as anyone from New York City could tell you, while you do become numb to a certain amount of static noise as a fact of life, when you're in a really terrible mood and some striking, violent, metallic pounding keeps shocking you awake, you kinda wanna die. In the great tradition of Neon Genesis Evangelion, the scene at Renton's high school explains a global catastrophe which led the world into its current state, although it's hard to understand exactly what's being described at this point without knowing what a scub coral is yet. Most of the explicit plot details explaining how the world ended up the way that it is happen in the latter half of the show, and we'll get into how much of that I think is interesting later on, but this scene mostly wants to tell us about how Renton's father is credited with putting a stop to the Summer of Love tragedy, which had caused all of the compact drives that control technology to freak out, by sacrificing his own life. It's interesting to note how this is and isn't similar to Evangelion. Both shows have the main character uncomfortably singled out as the product of an important father whom they feel no real connection to as he didn't really raise them, and both shows describe a global catastrophe taking place right around when all of the main characters were born. Whereas Shinji was the type to obediently follow the rules and try to look like he's paying attention even when he's completely dissociated, Renton is more of the fuck class I'ma read magazines type. I feel the need to note that I had actually gone from being much more like Shinji when I watched that show at age 14 to being way more like Renton when I watched this show at age 16, and indeed spent the majority of 11th grade reading manga through classes I wasn't sleeping through with every intention of dropping out, but never doing so because a cute girl in a mecha never crashed into my bedroom to invite me away. The scub coral emerging underneath the school in the middle of class only to be brushed off by the teacher is pure Mobile Suit Gundam F91, while Renton getting teased by his classmates and then punching one of them in the face with eyes full of tears is pure Zeta Gundam. Attentive viewers will discover here that the banging machines all over town were in fact the devices used to remove the scub coral that emerges onto the surface. Given what we will eventually learn that the scub actually is, the thought that this problem, basically caused by the way humans structure their society, and then dealt with in a way that has such an oppressive effect on the human mind, is such a potent symbolic theme that I think it pretty much summarizes my engagement with the show almost all on its own. When I lived in Rochester, New York for a little while, and saw how the grid-structured roads constantly strangled traffic, and the smog from the Kodak factory strangled the air, and heard about all of the completely insane experiments in human development that transpired there over the decades, I could only think that an environment so disconnected from any kind of human naturalism couldn't possibly produce people with any understanding of how to even live within nature. Even being from Virginia Beach, which is a completely built-out stretch of dizzying suburban chaos and dystopian crafted nature experiences, I had to get out to real nature and experience silence for the first time in my life to actually understand just how much the chaos of my everyday environment has generated the chaotic state of my own mind. As Renton sits on the roof, he overhears the girls in class fangirling over Talho in the now familiar Rayout magazine, but also gossiping about how one of their parents says that the Gecko State members are a bunch of murderous lowlifes who shouldn't be trusted. Renton reminisces about the last time that he saw his sister, who told him that as long as he held on to the belief that he'd see her again, they would eventually meet once more. Now we understand why Renton was smiling at the sight of his compact drive even when he was lamenting his life earlier in the episode. It actually represents a sort of security blanket which he clings to for the only real feeling of hope he has in this world. But it's so satisfying that the girls in class find his expression creepy and end up dragging him back into the dumps. The more we get to know Renton, the more we can appreciate that he's actually very much not a spoiled kid, and if anything is kind of impressive for a person his age, especially after seeing the attitudes of his classmates. In certain ways, Renton has been stunted by the lack of guidance from his parents or his older sister, whom he clearly looked to as his main source of protection and influence up until her disappearance. But she's been gone since he was so young that he barely even really knew her at the time, and has a hazy memory of her even now. That's why in other ways, Renton has clearly had to grow up fast. He knows his way around machines and has free reign of the town because the only parental figure in his life is his mechanic grandfather. Having been called to the school over Renton's performance therein, Axel immediately dismisses the concerns, having no intentions of allowing Renton to join the military, which seems to be what this school really exists to prepare children for, which tells us a lot about the setting right away. Axel insists that Renton will take over his mechanics business while slamming a fist of the most worn down imaginable fingers to the table. This is a man who's worked every day of his long life and has no intention of stopping until he's dead. Considering his thunderous attitude, we can see where Renton gets the violently explosive temperament. The next short scene is absolutely perfect. We cut to Renton receiving a piping hot steak at a family restaurant in disbelief, asking his granddad if it's really okay, only to look up and see his grandfather utterly dejected, asking himself how he could let things get this way and how he would explain this to Renton's late mother, instantly sucking the flavor out of the meal and bringing Renton back to his Sayaku mantra. This moment hits so hard and feels so real that I would be shocked if this wasn't based based on someone's real experience. It tells us so much about Renton's relationship to his grandfather inside of like 10 seconds. As Renton rides out to his lifting spot, he mentally proclaims to his sister, whom we now realize his whole inner monologue has been addressed to in spirit, that all of these bad things in his life can all be forgiven as long as there are waves, as long as there is the chance to lift, and that's when the final straw is dropped on the camel's back. That despicable military has finally gated off his favorite lifting site to use for weapons testing. This town is truly the worst, and now that we have a full view of Renton's perspective, I think it's a lot easier to sympathize with his position. He's got enough self-awareness to realize that his situation could probably be worse, and that it might not be this way forever. But since he's a 14-year-old kid with no direction and no real power in this world that revolves entirely around the military, he feels completely stuck where he's at, with a desperation to do something about it and no idea what he's capable of. Returning to Renton's room, we finally get a full lens on it that realizes just how tiny his world is. From his perspective, Holland is absolutely free, just searching the world for awesome waves to ride and being a badass all day. Receiving the mysterious message Eureka on his compact drive, Renton fantasizes that it's a signal telling him that he'll soon be a member of Gecko State, which of course is foreshadowing. Granddad finding him drooling all over his compact drive draws a clear parallel to the comedy of getting walked in on masturbating, sort of giving this impression like the drive itself is a metaphor for Renton's most private emotions as symbolized by his most private parts. Trust me, we're gonna push this metaphor into space later. Axel accosts Renton for the state of his room and claims that a good mechanic needs to be organized. Renton doesn't want to be a mechanic, but Axel tells him that it's the only realistic expectation to have for his life. His father and sister had gone off to try and change society, but from Axel's perspective, nothing has changed at all. The world is still driven by the military and continues to try and rob him of his progeny. He tells Renton that it's fine to have whatever hobbies he wants, but that he needs to get real about what's actually possible in life, which Renton isn't willing to face. He accuses his granddad of just wanting Renton to make enough money to put him in retirement, which is offensive and wrong to Axel on so many levels that he can't even formulate a response through his rage. Much of Eureka 7's early story is going to be about finding the middle ground between Renton's idealized vision of what a life like Holland's would be like, and the reality of the world as it stands, which Axel is warning him about. If we couldn't tell already from the opening scene and everything implied by others about Holland, we will eventually see how he truly isn't free to do whatever he wants. He's on the run from the government, forced into Mortal Kombat regularly, and even as a surfer is only as badass as the waves allow for at a given time. And getting to the good waves can be a real task, as we'll see in another episode. Renton understands that it takes determination to become the person that Holland is, but he thinks it's just a matter of skills, of being in the position to develop the writing ability that gets you famous, when actually it's a whole completely different brand of determination driving him, which Renton is going to take about half of this series to start to really understand. Axel probably doesn't even doubt that Renton has the determination to become someone great. In fact, he expects him to become a great mechanic like himself. But he has enough perspective into what Renton actually thinks he's trying to do to realize that it entails something completely different from what Renton is expecting of that lifestyle. Luckily for Renton, his ordinary squabble with his granddad is interrupted when a mysterious LFO comes crashing in after a cut backdrop turn and lands squarely on Renton's room, destroying it completely. What emerges from the cockpit at Renton's full attention is the most beautiful girl he's ever laid eyes on, and he's immediately in love. Eureka's destruction of Renton's room represents the end of the identity that he had been building for himself up to that point. His idolization of Holland, his dream of freedom, his dissatisfied comfort with an unchanging life is all immediately forgotten when the coolest robot performs the coolest move he's ever heard of right in front of him, and then the coolest girl he's ever seen, who happens to be close in age to him, emerges out of it. We already know that Renton has an obsessive personality, and there's basically nothing that could possibly have invoked his obsessiveness in this moment more than Eureka. Returning from the eye catch, Axel calls in a favor from a friend with one of the scub coral digging machines who's willing to lie about why he's using it to the government. We get a clear sense that Axel has dealt with situations like this before thanks to his daughter's discoveries and is trying to protect Renton from going down the same road, while also remaining sympathetic to the cause that his daughter was fighting for and which continues to be fought for by the members of Gecko State. Renton climbs his way into the cockpit of the Nirvash in hopes of seeing the source files for all LFOs inside of it, since it is the prototype for all the others, and he's greeted with this gorgeous full body shot of Eureka, which gives me the perfect chance to talk about her design. Eureka's character design was by far the thing which captivated me the most about this show when I started it the first time, and I strongly suspect that I wouldn't have cared about the series at all if I hadn't connected with her character so powerfully. While I might have been in a more similar position in life to Renton, and like him felt romantically compelled by the existence of Eureka, in terms of their behavior and outward attitude and appearance, I found a lot more of myself in Eureka, particularly in those brilliantly round and kind of vacant eyes. Back in late 2007, the stuff that I was most obsessed with was Gunslinger Girl, Boogie Pop, Yuri art, and anything illustrated by Abe Yoshitoshi sensei, whom I talked about at length in my anime alphabet episode on Haibane Renmei. In particular, Iwakura Lane had been one of my favorite character designs, sort of muted and almost agender with only the slightest hints of femininity, and this cold, distant, and tortured demeanor with eyes that seemed sucked into themselves, like contained in a personal reality that we could never breach. And yet Eureka was even more obviously appealing to me, being not quite at that incredible distance from the rest of the world that I experienced watching Lane. Eureka 7 met me much closer to where I was at, on that boogie pop level where it's clear that the show was made to be as accessible as humanly possible, but by being built on ideas of what's good from such a specific perspective, inevitably reads as good mostly to people from a similar perspective. Capturing that Lane-esque sense of distance and mystery in the eyes, while also explosively popping in the hair color and outfit, suits my personal style a lot more closely. I also appreciate that Eureka wears a modest long-sleeve dress while showing off her pale skinny legs, because she looks cute and youthful in a way that isn't sexualized, but also obviously would turn on a 14-year-old boy at close proximity. Her short hair, her boots, and her curt attitude also lend her a kind of boyishness that heavily offsets the girliness of her dress and her hair clip. Instead of agender, I'd consider her a little closer to androgynous, but again, it's still with a clear flair to femininity that I just perfectly connect with. Lane and Eureka ended up being the first two characters that I bought figures of at Otakon 2008, along with a slew of Henrietta stuff, if that tells you exactly where my self-image was at around then. I'm sure I would have bought literally anything with Yunochi from Hidamari Sketch on it too, had there been anything for sale. I will dissect Eureka's character in depth as we go along, but I think it's extremely powerful that I felt so connected to this character just from seeing the design without understanding why at all until nearly 15 years later when analyzing my past relationship to the show from a distance. After geeking out at the sight of a cute girl who knows machines and has an oil spot on her dress, Renton announces, "I'm putting it in," and then reassures her not to worry because he has experience. As a mechanic, of course. I told you, the compact drive is his dick. He brags that a mechanic of his caliber can hear the voice of machines, but Eureka is unimpressed with this declaration and asks why he's stating the obvious. Instead of taking this as an insult, Renton is just so shocked that someone understands what he meant by that, it makes him fall even deeper in love with her. So much so, he doesn't register that she just said she's about to take a flamethrower to the rubble of her crash. Turns out Renton wasn't totally ready to move on from his old life just because he found a new squeeze. He shouts out how there was still stuff in there he could use, and he begs that he could have at least had a funeral for his stuff, moving through stages of grief pretty quickly and eliciting Eureka's laughter at his nonsensical antics. Eureka's smile takes Stoner by surprise as he spies with Matthew and Holland from a cliffside. I actually remember the first time I saw a part of this episode on Adult Swim when it aired in the US back in 2006 and being very confused about the whole setup of this situation, as I wasn't clear yet on how all the characters related to one another. It's kind of dense for a first episode if you're not giving it your full attention, but basically the conceit here is that Holland had to bring the Nirvash to Axel for a tune-up, but doesn't have the courage to actually face him or Renton directly. So instead, he sent Eureka in alone, knowing that Axel isn't going to turn away a young girl with no concept of society beyond her task, while he hangs back with the other guys to get a sense of the situation from a distance. As Holland laments how Renton is starting to look like her, we get our first indication that Holland's fear of showing his face is the result of having dated Renton's sister before she disappeared. Cutting back to Renton and Eureka inside the Nirvash, she asks him to remove his compact drive from the mech as nothing seems to be happening. The dialogue here reinforces the theme that was established in Renton's first flashback to his sister about belief, with Eureka claiming that belief isn't always a good thing because sometimes believing in something too much only for it to not pay off can crush you. Renton is struck listening to this, flashes back to his sister once again, and prepares to launch into a ferocious counter-argument before he's interrupted by Axel outing Eureka for being one of Holland's friends, and then stating that he was planning to hand over his granddaughter's discovery to whoever would show up to claim it. He says, "If this is what you're here for, then go ahead and take it, and then never appear before my family again," which offends Renton as a fan of Eureka, and sets her into a perturbed but understanding frame of mind. This drama is quickly interrupted when missiles rain down from above onto the workshop, and and blow it to pieces, injuring Axel and sending Renton to his side, and Eureka to the skies for the ensuing battle. Interestingly though, the action next brings us up into the military ship executing the attack, where a disagreement springs up among those aboard. Dominic, an information officer from the intelligence division, is upset that they've opened fire on the Nirvash without permission. The Air Force officer commanding the ship says that they weren't ordered to protect the Nirvash, and he's concerned about preserving the military's honor after their previous defeat at the episode's start. He pulls rank on Dominic to shut him up, and Dominic cringes at this arrogance. All of this to show us what will be reinforced continually throughout the series, that the military is constantly being hamstrung by breakdowns in communication, leading to their losses against Gecko State. In truth, I think this scene blows by a little too quickly, and I'm sure I didn't get as much out of it on the first viewing as I did when I already knew that I was going to be seeing a lot more of these characters going forward, and more about the military's function. With the Nirvash fighting in the sky above, Axel realizes that it's finally time to thrust some epic destiny onto Renton. He hands over the Amida drive, telling him that he needs to deliver it to that girl and blow them all away. In monomyth terms, this is the call to adventure moment writ as large as it possibly could be, with the ultimate authority figure in Renton's life literally brought low by his adversaries, begging from the ground up at his last progeny to fuck it all and avenge his ass before this bleak life is over. Renton springs into action, thinking that it's not for his granddad so much as out of his need to finish what he was about to say to Eureka before Axel and the missile strike cut him off. With all of the burning in his heart, he rides his bike right over a cliffside, ref board in hand, and begins freefall. The episode ending as he wonders if he might have just made a massive mistake. You couldn't ask for a more perfect bridge into the themes that are going to compel the entire first arc of this show, and arguably the whole thing. I can't say that I love the ending theme song. It's got a nice enough melody, but the woman's voice is a little grating, and the instrumentation isn't very memorable. Plus, it's a little too somber for this part of the show. Ironically, I think it would have made sense tonally to swap this one with Fly Away, which is too chipper for the show's second arc. I appreciate what they were trying to do with the camera movement tracking on the animation, but it looks a little awkward in places, and opening the ED on like 20 seconds of a bland aqueduct was a good way to get people to just skip it right off, probably. And that closes out the first episode of Eureka 7, as well as this first part of my Eureka 7 video series. I know I haven't really gotten to dive that deeply into the themes or characters yet since we're only on the first episode, but I hope you can appreciate just how insanely dense this episode is with detail, especially in the artwork and animation. This thing looks crazy, and none of the rest of the show is gonna look quite this good, but that's not a surprise or really like a condemnation because a few things look quite this good. In the next part of this video series, I will be covering the entire rest of the first arc going up through episode 13, so we'll be getting a lot more deep into things once we do that. That video will be coming soon, and if you want to help me to be able to create videos like this, please support me on patreon.com/goldenwitchfire, find more of my writing on goldenwitch.substack.com, subscribe for bonus articles and podcasts, find me at Golden Witchfire on all social media and payment platforms, listen to the 2 new podcasts that I have over on the ASE Presents channel, those being the hip-hop review show, The Jittery Zeitgeist, and also more of a general topic-driven podcast called The New Void Gazers Podcast, both of which I am one of the main hosts on, so check those out. You can find everything I do in the Every Video featuring the Golden Witch playlist, which is on the homepage of this channel, just in case it's hard to keep track. Even live stream VODs that I've unlisted can be found there, so, you know, there's endless hours of content. Thanks again for watching, and never forget, anime forever!